Hey freaks, it's JJ. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I talk about rock and metal concept albums and the stories that go behind them. As both an author and a metalhead, that's kind of my little niche I've found here on the internet. So today I will be talking about Kamelot's 2012 album, Silverthorn. And I cannot believe I have not talked about Kamelot on my channel before. I think what held me back is at one point I was going to cover Haven and Black Halo, but then I saw that another YouTuber had already covered that, and so I decided not to do it. But if you still want me to cover the rest of Kamelot's concept albums, let me know down in the comments, because I really should. I don't know why I thought that, just because someone else has already done it, that I shouldn't. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you want me to cover those other concept albums. But today's video comes as a request, so thank you to the anonymous person from my Metalhead community who requested this video. I always take video suggestions down in the comments, but if you want to jump to the top of the list, make sure you join my Metalhead community. Link is down in the description. It's totally free, and from there you get access to my video suggestion box, and I try to pull from there before I pull from suggestions from the comments. And yeah, you also get access to bonus videos and other concept albums explained that are not here on my channel. And it's free. Did I say that already? It's free. And before we get started with this content, make sure you hit subscribe if you haven't already, and make sure you like, share, and do all of that fun stuff that really helps with the algorithms. Anyway, settle in, because this might be a little bit longer of a video because there's a lot of story we have to cover here. The story explanation for this album comes from the booklet that was sold with the album release. So it's a 40-page little booklet that explains the story behind this concept album. It is actually very beautifully written. It's got this 19th century old style to it, which I really love, and I think it's executed very well. So I don't know who actually wrote it, but kudos to the author because it is very well done. Anyway, let's get started. Oh, I forgot to say, if you do not have the story booklet, you can't find it or you don't want to buy it, there is someone who uploaded pictures of it, so that's actually how I was able to read the story booklet. If you want to read it for yourself, I will link that down in the description if you want to check it out. I do highly suggest that you read it because it is very well written, and I've made a little link for you guys to easily find it. We start off with track 1, Manus Dei. I don't think I'm saying that right, but that translates to Hand of God. And this is a mostly instrumental track where I believe we're just kind of setting the scene and the tone for the album. In the story booklet, we begin this tale in the Cotswolds in the year 1865, when our protagonist was just a young child. So there's kind of a difference between the order of the story as far as the album goes and as far as the little story booklet goes. The story booklet pretty much goes chronologically, starting from when our protagonist was a young child up to current day. Well, current day for our protagonist, versus the album kind of flip-flops back and forth between current day and past. But I'll get into that as we go along. So, track 2, Sacrimony, Angel of Afterlife. So here we meet our protagonist, who does not have a name. It's just known as our protagonist. And he is in a prison cell, as he has been for many years. And he's kind of going a little crazy over time. We'll learn why here in a little bit. But he converses with this Angel of Afterlife, who sings to him in his cell, which kind of reminds me of the Angel of Music from Phantom of the Opera. I love Phantom of the Opera, by the way, so that's just what it reminds me of. But this kind of Angel of Afterlife kind of sings to him and keeps him a little bit sane over the years, because 10 years in solitary confinement has led our protagonist to decide that, all these secrets that he's kept in for so many years has, been too much. He's finally deciding he needs to let them out, let go of all these secrets, and the only way to do that is to tell his story and finally let the truth come out. So he begins writing on the walls of his prison cell, and what follows is his life story. Track 3, Ashes to Ashes. So this song takes place after a great family tragedy that was the death of their youngest sister, Jolie. So Julia was only 6 at the time when she died, and here we see how the family kind of is dealing with the grief of losing their youngest child. And so our protagonist and his twin brother, Robert, harbor a huge amount of guilt over their little sister's death, which I will explain in another track. But they feel very guilty about how she died, to the point where the two brothers make this pact with each other to never tell a living soul what happened the day that she died. And they seal their pact by branding the word Veritas across their chest, and that means truth. And so that's how the brothers are dealing with the loss of their sister. Meanwhile, their father becomes an alcoholic and takes to beating Robert quite often. And their mother, she kind of retreats into herself. She retreats into the woods, where she has this little chapel built where she goes to pray and meditate and kind of just get away and deal with her grief. Their mother, Viviana, is also a very skilled cellist. She would play this really, really heart-wrenching, sad song on the cello whenever, they were going through times of peril. And so after Jolie's death, this song kind of became their family's anthem, their family's theme song, because after Jolie died, their family ends up seeing a lot more loss and grief. So we flash forward a number of years, and we see how this secret is starting to take its toll on the two brothers. So Robert has especially been through hell because he is constantly beaten by his father, who has become an alcoholic. And it doesn't really explain why the father decides to beat Robert mostly and not really our protagonist, but that's what happens for some reason. So that drives Robert to leave when he is 17 years old. He kind of runs away from home, and we don't really see a whole lot of Robert throughout the rest of the story. But in this track, I believe this song takes place just before Robert's re-emergence in our protagonist's life. And I think this song shows Robert's kind of spiral into madness, which will be explained a little bit more as we go along. Track 4, Torn. So here we check back in with our protagonist, who is telling his story by etching the words into the walls of his prison cell. So over the course of his 10-year imprisonment and during his trial that, sentenced him to prison in the first place, he has not said a single word. And so the solitude and the silence have kind of made our protagonist relive moments in his life over and over. They play out in his mind like hallucinations. And the only way to stop these hallucinations is to continue writing out his story and telling the truth for the very first time, no matter how painful it is. So that takes us into track 5, Song for Jolie. And I imagine this track as going back to kind of explain what happened to Jolie and how she died. So our protagonist and his brother were flying a kite near the river when they were young boys. And they were having a grand old time when Jolie decided to join them. So Jolie wants to fly this, magnificent dragon kite that these brothers are playing with. But her being only 6 years old, the brothers are like, you're too small to hold on to it properly. You're just going to wreck it. You're going to break it. And they go about kind of, teasing her a bit before finally letting her fly the kite. And so the brothers continue to tease her while she's flying the kite. They say, she's not big enough or good enough to control the kite, and she's just going to crash it and break it. But this little girl, of course, is determined to prove that she can do it. A thunderstorm begins rolling in, and suddenly a big gust of wind knocks Jolie backward. But she's so determined to prove herself, she continues holding on to the kite, even as her dress gets caught in a tree, and she ends up slipping and falling backward and tumbling over the precipice into the river, where she ends up drowning. So the brothers never ever talk about this or tell anyone what happened on the day that she died, because they know that, if they hadn't been teasing her so much, there's a big chance that she probably would not have fallen into the river and drowned. Track 6, Veritas. So here we explore the two drastically different ways that these brothers have dealt with their guilt over time. So our protagonist is kind of able to move on with his life. He goes to school, he meets a woman named Aurora, whom he falls in love with almost, at first sight. Our protagonist, finishes his studies and then goes on to marry Aurora with plans for a happy life and a happy future. With the Veritas on his chest, just kind of like a sad reminder of the past that he tries to forget. Meanwhile, Robert has never been able to move on with his life. The guilt kind of ate him alive, and he's become sort of like a phantom at family funerals. So after Jolie dies, a number of their family members begin dying one by one over the years. And so Robert goes back and, for each funeral, he returns to play his mother's sad song on the cello from a private room during the funeral. Of course, our protagonist would always try and go seek him out, because he recognizes that really sad melody, but all he would ever find was a warm seat and a white rose left over from after Robert had already fled the funeral. And so The weight of the Veritas on Robert's chest, along with, the emotional and physical trauma of his father's beatings over the years, has slowly turned him into a monster, making him hate the world and anyone who achieves happiness while he dwells in misery. Track 7, My Confession. So after marrying Aurora, our protagonist's life is going quite well. He's found happiness after so many years of misery and is looking forward to the future. He and Aurora go to his aunt's funeral, where he again hears, the melody of his mother's sad song, although his mother's been dead for many years. But again, he finds only a warm chair and a rose in the room where the music was coming from. So our protagonist goes home and retreats into the woods to visit the chapel that his mother had built. It is there that he is suddenly overwhelmed with this need to confess to God all of his sins. So he rips off his shirt, and shows the Veritas on his chest, and he confesses to God, all this guilt that he's been holding in and harboring over his sister's death for all these years. And so our protagonist leaves the chapel after his confession, feeling like a new man with, decades of guilt lifted off his shoulders. However, as he is returning home, he hears his mother's sad song coming from inside his house. Dun dun dun. Track 8, Silverthorn. Just a quick aside here. I mentioned earlier that our protagonist's mother, Vivian, was a talented cellist. However, I forgot to mention that her husband, he adored her playing, and as a wedding gift, he gave her this beautiful, bejeweled cello bow with a silver tip, which Vivian took to calling her Silverthorn. Anyway, back to the cliffhanger of our story here. Our protagonist is just emerging from the woods and breaks into a run when he hears his mother's melody. He runs into the house, he finds Robert there, and Aurora dead with his mother's silverthorn pierced through her chest. Track 9, Falling Like Fahrenheit. Upon the discovery of his wife's murdered body, our protagonist is overwhelmed with grief. He becomes kind of paralyzed by it, and as the authorities arrive, he doesn't say a single word as Robert steals his identity, pretending to be Aurora's husband and pointing at our protagonist as the murderer. Our protagonist is then taken away, and instead of defending himself against the lies of his brother, who has just assumed his identity, he accepts his punishment, feeling like a lifetime in prison is the atonement that he deserves after what happened to Jolie all those years ago. Track 10, Solitaire. Our protagonist spends the next 10 years in prison, praying and trying to do his penance. He is visited by the Angel of Afterlife, which is actually Jolie as a young woman, or at least the spirit of Jolie as a young woman. She sings to him and brings him a measure of peace and tries to show him that she has forgiven him. And that takes us to track 11, Prodigal Son. This track, I think, kind of summarizes the brothers' journey. Part 1, Funeral, depicts the brothers' grief, during their sister's funeral. Part 2, Burden of Shame, shows the brothers making their pact to keep the secret about Jolie's death, and they brand themselves in the hopes that the pain of their branding will pay for their sins, and then they vow to take the truth to their graves. Part 3, The Journey. Here is where the two brothers' paths divide. Robert ran away, which left our protagonist the sole inheritor of his family's estate and fortune. So Robert kind of dwells in his misery, becoming this hopeless vagabond. His evil tendencies grow from his father's beatings and only expand when he sees the happiness of his brother. And so eventually, envy and hatred is what drives Robert to steal his brother's happiness away from him. And to our 12th and final track, Continuum. This instrumental track, I believe, kind of relays the epilogue of the story from the story booklet. So after our protagonist has finished writing his story on the walls, he finally breaks his silence and tells what truly happened. He proclaims his innocence to a judge and brings witnesses to corroborate his innocence. And so finally, after 10 years, our protagonist is set free while his brother is put into prison for murdering Aurora. And our protagonist then tries to move on with his life. He begins playing the cello and still, hears the voice of his angel of afterlife from time to time. But he's looking forward to, rebuilding a life, a happy life, when one day he is sitting on a park bench in London and he hears his mother's melody. So that's how our story here ends, and I think it's very beautifully done. Sometimes it's a disconnect between the story and the music, but the music feels like it fits the story perfectly. I kind of want to share with you guys a little section from the story booklet. I just thought it was really well done, and it really exemplifies the moral of this whole story in this album. So it's from the epilogue, and it goes, "I have taken up playing the cello once again. Sometimes I harmonize with my angel, who still sings to me to calm the ghosts of chaos which linger in an inner chamber of my heart. Never again will I forget. I've come to realize that one should never cast their tragedies aside to be forgotten once happiness steps back into their life. If you make peace with devastation and embrace it as part of your character, it will remain a strength. Otherwise, it could rear its ugly head later in jealous competition against contentment." So yeah, I thought that was really beautifully written. And yeah, that is the whole moral that you're supposed to extract from the story is, not trying to forget about your grief, your tragedies, but embracing it and making it a strength instead of trying to ignore it or hide it or bury it deep down. And so that is the conclusion of our story. I do think it is worth mentioning here that there is a theory on the internet that's kind of cool and worth talking about. The theory goes that Robert and our protagonist are actually the same person. They're not twins. They are one person. Our protagonist suffers from DID, dissociative identity disorder, and he came up with Robert as an identity that he used to deal with his father's beatings. While the Angel of Afterlife is also another one of his identities that formed to help him through his prison sentence. So I find that really interesting. I do think if you're just looking at the lyrics of the album, there is evidence in the lyrics that this could be the case. However, if you're only looking at the story booklet that came with the album, as far as like just that story goes, I don't think there's a lot of evidence of that being the case, of Robert and our protagonist being one person. But yeah, I do think it's an interesting theory to explore. I don't personally find that it's true, just from my own interpretation, because I think mostly just because I feel like the story is better off with the protagonist and Robert being separate people. But please let me know what you think of this theory down in the comments, if you think there is more evidence that, this theory is correct, or if you think that these two characters are two separate people. Let me know down in the comments. Also, let me know any other thoughts you have on this album as far as the story goes, or things that I left out because I just didn't have time. But yeah, let me know if you've read the booklet, and let me know your thoughts on it. Also, again, let me know if you want me to cover other Kamelot concept albums. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you hit subscribe, join my Metalhead community, all that good stuff. And till next time. Oh, I just brushed my teeth, and that is really sour.